After the high-octane politics of last year, this was consciously a budget low on drama.
When will things actually get better, Chancellor?
The biggest surprise, a new forecast from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. Subject to quite a lot of doubt, but grabbed by the Chancellor with both hands.
Today, the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts that because of changing international factors and the measures I take, the UK will not now enter a technical recession this year.
It'll make a difference to sentiment, potentially to investment.
Yes, because it's about the stories that we tell each other. So particularly if inflation starts falling quite dramatically as well, so that people really believe that we're through the worst of it, and we no longer have the official forecasters saying we're going to have a hugely long recession. That does alter sentiment.
Hello, boys and girls.
Jeremy Hunt said the country needed to boost the size of its workforce, one arm of the policy trying to lure parents back into the workplace, extending the government's 30 hours of free childcare from parents of 3- and 4-year-olds to parents of children over 9 months of age.
Lift it up, and then you'll see your flower.
The government says it's heard the complaints of the nursery sector, that they're short of cash and staff to help expansion. The government insists, as the policy is phased in, it'll take on their concerns.
We struggle to find enough staff now to look after our children we've currently got. If there is a massive influx of children due to this 30 hours, we don't have the staff to cater for more children. So you'll be left with a bunch of parents who are entitled to 3 hours and no one to actually give them.
On top of more free childcare, the measures to boost the labour market cycle include scrapping the work capability assessment to lure some of those on benefits back into jobs or boost their working hours. And the government's scrapping the limit on tax-free pensions.
For too many, turning 50 is a moment of anxiety about the cliff edge of retirement, rather than a moment of anticipation about another 2 decades of fulfilment.
The government wants to reduce the allure of early retirement. It's specifically triggered by an exodus of NHS doctors who quit or cut their hours because the pension cap means work doesn't pay. Though the government says it hopes its policy would make other experienced workers think twice about leaving employment.
The change in the pension allowances was a big factor in my decision to retire. So yes, I think that would have possibly had an impact in terms of me working maybe for a few more years.
I think the 1 million and taking the limit off wouldn't have had much effect on me.
The Office for Budget Responsibility estimates in 5 years' time, 110,000 more people could be turning up to work thanks to these government measures. The OBR report reveals a much bigger contribution to the workforce could come from immigration. 245,000 coming from abroad to work here.
Well, we now have control, of course, over our immigration policy. The government has clearly decided it's not aiming for tens of thousands, it's aiming for hundreds of thousands, because we do have a really serious skills and worker shortage.
Don't talk about it much, do they? The Chancellor said to help with the cost of living, he was continuing the cap on energy bills at £2,500 and freezing fuel duty yet again at a cost of £6 billion, easing, not removing economic pain.
The big picture is still pretty grim. If you look at this year and next, we're talking about income falls because of the high inflation, and over those 2 years, that's the biggest income fall on record.
Having already announced he was reversing Liz Truss's cutting corporation tax, the Chancellor unveiled £9 billion in investment tax breaks, giving back some of that revenue. But he's only found enough cash to book the policy for 3 years, so he can stick with his own debt rule.
His desire to have debt falling as a share of national income in 5 years' time gave him very little room for manoeuvre in terms of permanent tax cuts or spending giveaways by the end of the 5-year period. And so that means he's done things like particularly making the investment allowances for business investment only a 3-year policy rather than a permanent policy.
Just to make his sums add up so he can meet his own rule.
To help make the sums add up so it doesn't cost him anything in years 4 and 5. It's not good policy making.
With inflation down, debt falling and growth up, the declinists are wrong and the optimists are right. We stick to the plan because the plan is working, and I commend this statement to the House.
Tories cheered as Rishi Sunak congratulated Jeremy Hunt. But much of what was announced today was rewriting past Tory budgets. Jeremy Hunt has reversed George Osborne's pension allowance cap. The old Tory mantra of keeping net migration below the tens of thousands is jettisoned. Kwasi Kwarteng's massive cut in corporation tax, already dumped, now confirmed. And unlike the last Tory government, this one is demanding Office of Budget Responsibility estimates rather than refusing them. Remembering back, we thought Jeremy Hunt was brought in to dismantle the work of Kwasi Kwarteng's brief chancellorship. It looks here as though he's also dismantling quite a lot of George Osborne's legacy.
There is quite a sense in which Jeremy Hunt, following on from Rishi Sunak, is reversing a set of tax policies that George Osborne had launched in 2010 and then 2015. There's not been a clearly stated strategy that they're deliberately moving in the opposite direction.
But they clearly don't believe in a lot of things that George Osborne did.
If you take it all together, it does go in exactly the opposite direction to George Osborne's reforms.
A hopelessly divided party caught between a rock of decline and a hard place of their own economic recklessness, dressing up stagnation as stability as their expiry date looms ever closer.
At the other end of Whitehall, strikers from across the public sector marched but heard nothing new today about their pay demands. A reminder of the challenges that still buffet this government as it announced plans which the Office for Budget Responsibility said had the smallest amount of headroom it had ever signed off on.
And Gary is with me now for more.
In policy terms, a couple of interesting developments here. In the history of the welfare state, there will be a chapter on this strange expansion of the welfare state that happened in the 21st century when we decided to make it a provision of the state that there would be free childcare for people. And today we saw a sort of final brick put in that wall there with provision from 9 months and above. And that brick's probably going to stay there. The whole wall's going to stay there. It's a new bit of the welfare state. Another interesting development was the amount of money that the government threw at the idea of trying to get older people back into the labour market, very much focused and triggered by this idea that they want doctors to stop giving up early or winding down their hours early. But it's a hell of a lot of money they've thrown at this in order to get an unknown number of doctors back in. In fact, though, probably what we'll be thinking of in years to come, what our destinies are shaped by is not the policy announcements, but the economic outlook that the Office for Budget Responsibility puts in its book out today. Living standards still look bleak, growth looks bleak, debt looks eye-watering. I think the other takeaway from today, though, was the politics of it all. It almost felt a bit normal. You had a Chancellor lasting long enough in the job to give a budget. That was quite quaint. You had an attempt to shoot a Labour fox on that welfare policy we were talking about, and you didn't have a revolution being announced. The Tory party was not going off into the wild blue yonder, but was getting onto, in rather traditional style, onto Labour terrain. So it felt normal, but probably deceptively normal, given the lurgies, the bogies that still lie in this book here.
Thanks, Gary. So what makes up Jeremy Hunt's £22 billion package of government spending and tax breaks? And what will that mean for the economy? Our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, has been going through all the details and is with me now. Helia.
Chris, the Chancellor was very keen today to talk up the improving picture for UK's economy. He wants to prove to the markets we're stable. He wants to prove to the trustees that we're focused on growth. So let's take a look at those numbers, because the difference for this year is stark. Back in November, the OBR, the watchdog, the fiscal watchdog, said that growth was going to contract by 1.4%. Today, it said that the economy would only shrink by 0.2% with no technical recession. But if you look at the back end of forecasts, you see that growth falls from 2.2% to 1.9%. And even then, it's below our trend growth rate of 2.4%. And you heard Gary talking about all of the slew of policy decisions to get growth going, to get the workforce going. But actually, the two biggest drivers of this improving economic picture is one, falling gas prices, and two, falling inflation. And neither of those have anything to do with the inhabitants of the building behind us.
Now, what about the business investment? This is a £9 billion package of tax write-offs, effectively. what impact is that going to have?
I mean, quite a stark impact, and it needs to, because let's take a look at the problem that Mr. Hunt is trying to solve. This is business investment since 2016. You can see it's basically stalled and essentially fallen off a cliff after that. You know, the OBR today said that the cumulative loss in business investment amounts to £340 billion. Now, whether that's Brexit, the pandemic or instability, that's not clear. What is clear is that a lack of business investment amounts to waning growth.
Now, government's saying better growth, but no one's breaking out the champagne.
No, don't break out the champagne quite yet, and I'll give you two reasons why. First, living standards. The economic forecast might have improved somewhat, but the OBR still says that the squeeze on household incomes amounts to the two biggest year falls since the 1950s. The other sting in the tail is public services. If you look at government plans, the back end of the plans shows that government spending on departments is only going up by 1%. Now, if you take health and assume that defence is going to be more than that, that means austerity for other departments.
There's a lot of turbulence going on around the world. What about the global economy and all these banks that are going...
You're absolutely right. We saw two US banks fail over the weekend. Today, Credit Suisse, one of Europe's biggest and most prestigious lenders, saw its market share price tumble after one of its biggest investors refused a capital call live in an interview. That created shockwaves across markets, including here in the UK, where the FTSE had its biggest one-day fall since the pandemic. And all of this tells you, Krish, that the world is increasingly nervous about an environment where money isn't free anymore, where interest rates are going up. And it's that old Warren Buffett adage, you know, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked, and that's going to create turbulence.
Harriet Ebrahimi, thank you very much. Well, I've been speaking to Victoria Atkins, the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, and I began by asking why the public should thank the government when living standards continue to fall.
So the reason that we are all finding life tougher at the moment is because of the rate of inflation. The inflation hurts everybody, but it particularly hurts those who earn the lowest or who are most vulnerable. So this is why the Prime Minister has made halving inflation his number one promise to the British people. And this is why halving inflation is so significant, because our money goes, our pay packets don't go as far as they should do.
But despite that, people will have less money.
Because
standards of living are falling.
Which is why inflation is so important, but also the other elements that we're introducing through the budget. For example, freezing fuel duty. That's going to help countless people around the country who have to rely on a car or a van to get around.
It's not an environmentally sound policy, that is it?
No.
It's not great for net zero.
No, but we've got a very, very good record on net zero, carbon capture and so on.
You're spending £3.8 billion on about 15,000 people making their pensions better. It's another gift to the rich for the top 1%.
Well, actually, it's a measure to help us with our targets when it comes to NHS backlogs. We need, obviously, the help of doctors and nurses to do that.
How many of those 15,000 do you expect to be doctors?
And the BMA, that has lobbied us for quite some time on this, has described this single measure as transformational for the NHS.
Well, how many more doctors do you think we will get staying on in work?
But what we know from speaking to senior doctors and consultants, as well as the BMA, we know that this is a really strong factor in people saying, that's it, I'm retiring. So we want to do everything we can to encourage doctors, consultants and everyone to stay in the NHS. This is part of the many, many measures we're bringing in to try to help the economy grow. I mean, the Chancellor did a huge programme of work on trying to encourage people back into the workforce, including, I'm delighted to say, people living with disabilities. There is such untapped potential there. And so there are many, many ways in which to help the economy grow, and we have genuinely looked at everything we can to pull every lever we can.
When we talk about people feeling poorer, one of the reasons is going to be because taxes are going up next month. I mean, is that why you became a Conservative?
No, I came into politics to help people. I came into politics because I do believe in lower taxes, and as soon as we can, we will be making movements. But the one principle that Jeremy, the Chancellor, has put into this budget, as well as growing the economy, is fiscal responsibility.
How concerned are you by the turmoil around Credit Suisse? is there a systemic risk of a run on the banks?
No. We are very confident in the regulation of our banking sector. In fairness, because of what has happened in the past, and indeed the events of the weekend shows how quickly our regulator, the Bank of England and others, reacted to that individual situation.
If you look out across the next few years, the truth is the forecasts are pretty grim, aren't they? I mean, growth is going up and then down. It's all pretty flat. There's not a lot to get excited about when it comes to looking at Britain's future.
I think there is. I mean,
less than 2% growth. That's exciting.
I feel. I just think that we've got to have confidence and ambition and hope for ourselves. We've all had, frankly, a pretty tough few years with the pandemic. It has been extraordinarily difficult for some people. And our job now is to recover the economy from that. We've got to recover from the war in Ukraine as well. That's had an impact on all of our cost of living and our livelihoods. And we've got to look to the future with hope. We're feeling, quietly determined to deliver for the British public, but I don't think we should be too downbeat. I really don't. I want to cheer you up.
Victoria Atkins, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, if today's budget was all about expanding the workforce, there were plenty of workers today who were staying away. 400,000 public sector staff, from teachers to tube drivers, were all out on strike in their long-running disputes. But what has the Chancellor got to offer the jobless and get them back into work? Our North of England correspondent Claire Fallon has been finding out.
Billed as the back-to-work budget, with an inflation-fuelled cost of living crisis as the backstory, along with a workforce without the workers to power economic growth, and a winter of walkouts that's still going, even though it's spring.
This is a cocktail of lots of different issues, and with so many prices soaring up, we just can't compete with it, and that's why lots of people are really considering their position in this profession.
Are you considering whether you carry on?
I am, sadly, yeah.
Among the hundreds of thousands making budget day, also a strike day, is Zara.
Beat you hard, come on.
As of late, not only a history teacher in South Manchester. So what's the second job that you're doing?
I work at a bar as well.
Serving
Part-time,
pints?
yeah. Sometimes in the evening after school and sometimes at the weekends as well.
Your catchment area has got some of the highest levels of child poverty in the country.
Yeah.
These are kids who are disproportionately affected by having even more time off school, and by being out here, they're not in class.
They're not, but I think that ultimately, if you've got teachers going to food banks and you've got teachers that have got a second job, we aren't able to provide the education that we should be able to provide. So yeah, we don't want to be out here.
The budget's back-to-work focus didn't extend to even a mention of public sector pay. More focus on over 50s, the age group making up a much bigger proportion of the so-called economically inactive since the pandemic. Apprenticeships for over 50s to return to work. Returnerships, apparently. We're in Lancaster, with women who, in theory, are who the back-to-work incentives are meant to appeal to. They've lived all the barriers the Chancellor talks about.
I worked for 35 years in London in a chartered accountancy, but they take younger and younger people. I don't resent it, but I don't want to be sidelined.
They've worked, contributed, and been unpaid carers for children, grandchildren, and parents. Now, they've been coming here to sessions at the Growing Club to get the skills and confidence to set up in business.
Is part of the reason why you're looking at setting up your own business because employed jobs won't work for you?
Yes, probably, partly yes. I've got my grandchildren now. I'd like to have a little bit of life as well, and being able to be flexible with my own business so that I can earn enough money without having to claim any benefits or anything else like that.
To Jane, who runs the training here, one of the budget measures did sound promising, subject to small print.
But a lot of women that come to us have been on long-term sick, and they're very scared, actually, of losing their benefits. And they need that gradual change. So if that's implemented well, that could be really helpful.
On the messaging, though, it's less positive.
So when the Chancellor talks about instilling a sense of duty on over 50s to get off the golf course and get back to doing a couple of days' work a week, maybe.
I couldn't afford to go on a golf course. It's too expensive. Who are these people?
Well, I've been speaking to Labour Shadow Treasury Minister Abena Opongasari, and I began by putting to her, Labour must agree with the vast majority of today's budget.
The reality today was the budget was an opportunity for the government to address the cost of living crisis and look at how they can make sure people's lives are a lot better. I have to say it was quite underwhelming. What we saw was a sticking plaster over 13 years of economic failure.
So the measures they've taken, I mean, you support them, don't you? Is there anything that you oppose?
I'm not saying we support them.
Well, is there anything you oppose?
So there are concerns we have, so it's great to see the government put something in terms of childcare. This is something that we know families up and down the country are struggling. If you have more than one child, it's even more difficult.
So you support that? So what do you oppose?
So the concern about that is it's not actually going to be implemented until 2026. Right now, people need childcare support. If Labour was in government, we would have made sure that the plan was in place.
Well, it's coming in next year, isn't it? It's not 2026.
The reality is it's going to take some time before it's implemented.
But are there any of these measures that Labour opposes?
So there are things that we are concerned about where there's been a tax cut for the 1% rich. Why would you implement this in the middle of a cost of living crisis?
The pension changes. So you're opposed to that?
That is something that we're concerned about.
I mean, the government says that will keep NHS doctors in the NHS and stop them retiring early.
Well, we'll have to see the detail on that. I don't believe that's the case, really, because the reality is there are many other things that the government could have made a lot easier. This is a tax cut for the rich, the 1%. How is that going to help hard-working families up and down the country?
Isn't the problem for Labour that Rishi Sunak keeps saying he will do something and then he does it?
We've had 13 years of a Tory government. We've seen things haven't particularly gone well. And actually, quite a number of the things that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have implemented today are things that Labour's been calling for. You know, this is welcome news, but why has it taken so long?
So this was a Labour budget?
A number of the recommendations that we put forward, for example, prepayment meters, scrapping those prepayment meters, there's going to be a temporary hold on that. The government's announced that in conversation with Ofgem. That is great, but these are things that we've been calling for some time.
I mean, again, isn't that the political problem for you, though, that every time you call for something that might be sensible and affordable, the government might just do it?
I mean,
and then what's the point of having a Labour government?
I mean, the fact is, if we didn't have a strong Labour opposition, the government wouldn't have any ideas to bring to the table.
Maybe that's the best place for you.
I disagree with that. I think we really need to be in government to be able to implement these and implement them much better. You know, there was nothing in there about what they were going to do in terms of delivering on meeting their climate change objectives.
Are you saying that there was actually space for a radical budget, a budget that would have made a huge difference?
I mean, first of all, the budget wasn't radical at all. It was quite underwhelming, if I'm going to be completely honest. I even saw the Deputy Prime Minister almost falling asleep and Tory MPs leaving the room. I feel that with the government, a lot of the time they've been talking about is how other countries have been implemented or the fact that Ukraine has been the issue. The reality is they've been in government for 13 years and it's the fact that we've had low growth in this country because the ideas have not been very ambitious from this government in terms of delivering.
Abena Opongasari, thank you very much. Well, opposition parties have accused the Chancellor of failing to go far enough to help households struggling with the cost of living crisis. The Scottish National Party put forward their own 5-point plan, which they said would boost pay, reduce household bills and lead to sustained growth.
And they could have gone further to introduce real fairness and raise more cash to really support the economy and really boost trade. Ending non-dom status, not mentioned today. Taxing share buybacks, not mentioned today. Not doing, but scrapping costly vanity nuclear power projects and investing in real green renewables.
The cost of the weekly shop is up. Energy prices are up.
all because of Conservative chaos. Yet this government has offered no immediate help with the cost of living. They are so out of touch, they might as well be on a different planet. The Chancellor could have done so much more if only he cared enough. He had enough money in the Treasury to cut people's energy bills by £500 and take them down to last April's levels, yet he simply chose not to.